Hey everybody, it's Robot here from Vespa Motorsport and ScooterWest.com. So you're looking to fix one of your old modern Vespas? You're covered on ScooterWest.com. We stock pretty much everything to fix one of these up, whether you're doing cosmetic repairs or mechanical repairs. So let's get started on this one right here. This is a 2009-ish, 2008 Vespa S150. It's a pretty cool scooter. It's got 150 miles. It's quite hammered. Like somebody owned it. It sat in a yard for a while. And now it's got a new owner. Some kids up in LA that bought it. And they were trying to get it running. And there's a lot of problems with this thing. And I'm going to troubleshoot all those problems and get this thing running again. So I'm just going to go over the scooter problem by problem. We'll start with the first one. The first one is the customer was not too experienced on working on scooters, and they were just taking apart things, replacing parts willy-nilly. Unfortunately, when it comes time to bring it to the hands of a professional, they've already made a mess of it. It usually takes me more effort to take back steps to figure everything out when somebody's taken something apart and made a mess of it. I'll start with the first mess on this scooter. So they told me that they replaced the CDI and the lock set. And I was like, why'd you do that? And they were aware that many of the scooters have an immobilizer chip that's built into the key of most Vespas. Well, guess what? The Vespa S model never had an immobilizer system. So the first thing I took a look at was the ignition or CDI box. And I looked at the part number on it and I was like, oh, the part number is for an LX150. And believe it or not, they may look identical, but electrically they're different. Even the pinouts on the connectors are different. So I asked them, do you have the original CDI that came out of this bike? And fortunately they did. The part number on this is 639347. And vice versa, you cannot buy this CDI and just directly throw it into a scooter that does have the immobilizer system, such as the Vespa ET4 150 or LX 150. So I plugged in the stock original S150 CDI. Good thing is the lights all come on. We'll check for spark. It should have spark, but we have more problems to go. All right, let's go check the next thing. There's a rabbit hole of problems in here. So underneath the seat, I look under here, I'm like, oh, what did you guys do? They say, oh, we rebuilt the carburetor. And just me looking at it, it is a mess. The 2009 Vespa LX and S150, they did not have a vacuum petcock. They went to electric fuel pump that's controlled by this little controller up near the seat, and this is the electric fuel pump. They told me they took this fuel pump apart. You can see it's all crimped. This is never intended to be taken apart. They said it was leaking fuel after that. And the fuel line that goes to the fuel tank, no fuel is coming out of it. You know, it's all disconnected and dismantled. So that fuel pump shot. That fuel pump is still available. It's rather expensive. Moving on to looking at stuff, they told me, oh, well, we rebuilt the carburetor. It's been sitting forever. Well, that carburetor is barely even in an intake manifold. That's a problem there. And then I just see, well, there's a screw missing. I hate to say it, I'm probably going to take apart this carburetor and just double check the work. But the first thing is we got to get fuel flow into it. I can tell you I've already tested this fuel pump. It does not work now that it's been taken apart. So it's pretty much trashed. Normally I would just replace the fuel pump. These fuel pumps are very, very reliable. They don't really fail unless they're on a scooter that's been sitting for a long time, such as this scooter. It's obviously with 150 miles in 2009. It's had some point of time where it's been sitting for quite a long time. You can go ahead and take out the mechanical fuel pump. We're going to do that. We're going to do a less costly repair. The owners of the scooter really did not want to spend a dime on it. We're asking for used parts. Couldn't really help them with the fuel pump because this is rather expensive. I'm going to go ahead and put the older style vacuum pneumatic petcock or fuel valve in the bottom of the tank. All those parts can be retrofitted. So the first thing we're going to do is get fuel flow restored to the carburetor. Got to fill the tank. Just to show you some other issues, where are the battery terminals? Never put the screws in there. That's not really acceptable. You can't really do much there, so I have to find some bolts in the nuts for the batteries, or a specific square nut that goes inside the battery terminal, then the terminal with a screw rest on top. So let's jump right into it. With any scooter that's been sitting, I give it a little sniff test, and it does kind of stink inside that fuel tank. Not surprising. I'll tell you, the gas these days has about 15% ethanol. You give it a couple months and it's already deteriorating. So we'll start by getting access to where the fuel, either the fuel strainer that's found on this model with the fuel pump is, or if you have the older models, the fuel tap. So this is the fuel tap right here, or the petcock. We're going to go ahead and remove this side skirt. Should have 2 screws, just a Phillips driver will remove the screws, but somebody's already dismantled the scooter, and that's not even the right screw in there. Somebody was not paying attention to details. This should be a really short screw, so I'll replace that with the correct screws upon assembly here. So you get that skirt off, and the camera's probably not going to get it too well, but right underneath the fuel tank, right about here, is where either the petcock is located or the strainer is. And I tell you one thing, is it's leaking gas right now. So it needs to come out anyways. Somebody's been either messing with it, or there's an O-ring that's starting to leak. So we're gonna go ahead and remove the clamp. You may be able to do it with a small Phillips screwdriver, or you may need a socket to loosen that little thing. So we're gonna get a little 7mm socket and pull that out. And you can see I have a pan ready, because when you pull that tap out, it's likely to lose some gas, even if you siphon all the fuel out of the scooter. So I'm gonna go ahead and loosen the clamp with a 7mm socket. Got a real shallow ratchet. You can do it with a 7mm combination wrench. And now you can see it's dripping. So at this point, we're gonna be prepared for the gas to start leaking out. Have a pan handy, obviously have some gloves, not the best idea to be touching fuel, and let the gas go. And that gas stinks. Oh, it's horrible smelling gas. And not surprising, it's just old gas mixed in. Anytime you have a scooter that's been sitting for several years, it's best to drain the fuel tank this way and get all the bad gas out of it. And you can pull the fuel tap off to get the flow out a little quicker. Just be prepared, you might have a couple gallons of gas in there, 2 gallons of gas, so might fill up a pan quite a bit. So that's pretty much the whole entire tank drained out. Just dribble a little bit towards the end. And of course, as anybody says, don't really mess with gas. It's pretty explosive. You don't have any sparks. This is very, very dangerous situation to do. Obviously, the motor's completely cool. Don't want to have any sparks, no smoking, no nothing around when you're draining this quantity of gas out of a tank. But then again, the tap was leaking, it was dripping on the muffler. It wouldn't be a good situation even trying to start the scooter with gas dripping out of the bottom of the tank. And of course, the best way to dispose of gas, if it's not too contaminated, you can dilute it. I would say 1 part, I would call it like bad gas, just old gas. If it's been contaminated with diesel, you got to dispose of it, with a disposal service. But if is gas that's this old, you can dilute it like 1 part to 10 parts good gas, and typically burn it in with a car in a larger motor, not having issues. But if there's goop or chunks or contamination such as water or diesel, you need to dispose of the gas other ways. Maybe you live out in the country, you can light a fire with it. So we're gonna go ahead and install a brand new vacuum petcock. This part was found on Vespas, 4-stroke Vespa automatic scooters from 1996 all the way up till early part of 2009. 575321, we always have these available. This is like one of our #1 selling parts. Gas tends to deteriorate rubber parts in it, so now that these Vespa LX and ET4 scooters are getting pretty old, these have deteriorated. We also have a two-stroke specific one. It's a different part number. You can find it on our website, scooterwest.com. But the easy thing to do before we install is go ahead and put the fuel line on. So I have fuel line 3/16, and of course we have this available on our website. And then for the vacuum line, this is fuel line dash 3.5 millimeter. So it's a much smaller hose for the vacuum hose. And they just it goes on this bar on the bottom. That's your vacuum input to turn on the fuel tap. And when there's a vacuum signal from the motor started, so when it pulls vacuum on this, it opens the diaphragm and allows the fuel to flow through the fuel line into the carburetor. But once the scooter is turned off or it falls over and the motor stalls out, the vacuum is no longer produced by the engine and turns the fuel off. And oftentimes I see these fail by either leaking fuel into the vacuum line, causes the engine to run really rich, or it no longer flows fuel where the motor just won't run. Another issue is this is the fuel filter for the scooter as well. A lot of people want to put inline fuel filters, not needed because the petcock includes a brand new fuel filter. It's a real fine nylon strainer. It works great. There's not really any problems. And the act of pulling out the old fuel tap just drained all the sediment that may have built up in the engine. I'd recommend putting some type of hose fastening clips. In the shop, I have a special tool and these hose clips. I don't expect the average home user to have a whole assortment of these kind of clips. They're just really easy to use. We use them in our service department, have the special tools to put these on, along with other types of crimp fasteners, but that is very, very tight. They work great, but again, not really a needed part. And even for the vacuum line, there's even a smaller size clip. You can see the wire gauge is a little smaller, and you can put that on there. I highly recommend putting some type of clip or hose clamp that secures the hose. There's no way this is pulling off. Last thing you want is the hose kind of deteriorates or changes size and it falls off while you're riding and you start leaking gas and lose power to the engine. So the clamp is still located up onto the tank. It didn't fall out. You know, you could loosen it. Looks like a regular hose clamp, and pretty much just like the reverse, we'll put the new fuel tap up in there and then tighten the clamp to get the old strainer out of the way. And ironically, I checked that strainer. For some reason, it wasn't even flowing gas, so there might be obstruction in the fuel line. And the other important thing is you want to have the lines kind of point towards the carburetor. So you got to push it all the way up into the tank. There's a little bit of friction, especially if the clamp's in place. And there's also an O-ring that seals the whole assembly. And now we'll go ahead and tighten the clamp, and we're all set. So go ahead and tighten the hose clamp, and you don't want to over tighten it. It's a plastic fuel tank. They're very, very rugged, and they work great, but it only needs to be enough to hold the fuel tap in place. So the reason this old tap, or you want just a fuel spigot, was leaking fuel from the bottom of the tank, you see this O-ring right here? It's completely flattened out and deteriorated. Pretty common issue on any of these carbureted Vespas that are over 10 years old. And of course, you could just be cheap and replace the O-ring, but I always just recommend replacing the whole entire tap. Like I said, normally these fuel pumps are very, very rugged, but this thing's been disassembled. We just replace it with the less expensive vacuum fuel tap. So I'm gonna go ahead and eliminate this fuel pump, all the lines that were originally with this thing, get this all out of here. You can just leave the fuel pump disconnected. It's not gonna hurt anything. And there's this rubber boot that mounts, holds the fuel pump. And we're gonna leave that in place. If you're wondering what this valve here is, that's referred to as a rollover valve. And like the name says, if the scooter tips over on its side, the rollover valve, it does have like a ball in there. And when the scooter rolls over, it will block the fuel flow, so it will not flood the engine with gasoline, or the evaporative emission system that's found on these scooters. They rarely have problems. The evaporative emission systems are well designed on these scooters, not really issues. I always recommend leaving it in place. It's good for an environment. It's already there, and there's no need to really dismantle it. I have a lot of people that want to cap that stuff off. Why do you want to do that? I mean, the stuff's there for a reason. And we'll go ahead and put this bracket back all in place. And I'm gonna have to find some bolts to bolt it up, because the owners have lost all the bolts that go with this scooter. And if you're wondering what this wrench is, it's called an Easy Red. I have a whole entire set of them. For a light duty wrench, they work really good on a lot of scooter stuff. We don't sell them, but you can find them on Amazon or from a tool truck. It's got many different head locations and it locks in place. So it's really nice when you got really tight fasteners found on scooters. If you're a professional mechanic, I definitely recommend investing in it. If you're a pretty proficient home mechanic, a pretty nice tool to have. You know, you could put a bit in it. A little promotion for the Easy Red tool there. So let's go ahead and pull the carburetor out and see what kind of mess is in this carburetor. The clamps are already loose, pretty easy to do. It should come right out of this boot right here. You could get a flat bladed screwdriver to kind of pry it off. You know, the clamp is already kind of missing or loose on this, so no issues there. I see all sorts of other scratch marks on the carburetor. You got the pair of throttle cables on any of the later LXs and S150s. They're always going to have a pair of throttle cables. One pulls the throttle, one pushes. So it's kind of a safety net. So if the throttle gets stuck, you're able to push the throttle close. You got the pair of wires. This is going to be a pretty quick carburetor overhaul. I've done videos in the past that are like an hour and a half long on every single aspect of overhauling one of these carburetors. It's found on the GT 200. Pretty much the same carburetor is found on all these automatic Vespas. Very, very similar design. They got variations in size and jets between the different engines, but got the electrical connections, no big deal, disconnect them. One's a automatic choke or bi-starter cold starting device. And the other thing is a PTC thermistor that heats the carburetor body in very, very cold climates. And throttle cables, it's a 9mm wrench, a kind of odd sized wrench. Silver nut goes on the bottom of the carburetor and the black nut is on the top. So you got the push and the pull cable, only found on the very last of the carbureted Vespa LXs, Fly 150, Typhoon. So if you're going to overhaul the Vespa LX or S150 carburetor, ET4s use a different carburetor sometimes. I recommend having the float bowl gasket set. It's 842523, and what's included with this kit is the gaskets along with all the screws for the carburetor bowl. And I can see all these screws have been rounded a little bit, so it's just a good idea to do it. Get a whole set of screws, pretty inexpensive. And I'm just gonna quickly go through this carburetor. Like I said, it's not a very detailed carburetor overhaul video. It's just, I wanna see if there's any missteps that the guys that were working on this prior, you know, that they couldn't figure it out. You know, of course I could have just let fuel go into the carburetor and see if it's all working. And I assume they knew what they were doing, probably cleaned the jets. So let's just see. Sometimes you got the accelerator pump that kind of hangs up a little bit. You got to kind of tip the whole float bowl out of the way. Well, I can tell you one thing, that carburetor bowl is not clean. I'm gonna go in there and clean that out. I could send it through my ultrasonic cleaning machine. Another thing is this little rubber diaphragm is deteriorating and the clip's not in place. For the accelerator pump, this is a common spot that they tend to want to leak fuel. So I'll see what I can do about this, or you can even replace that little diaphragm there. So, you know, got to do a little bit more work on this bowl. You can see this gasket's really, really flat and hard. Let's go ahead and pull that out. And the last thing that we're going to pull out on the thing is the drain, because the new gasket set includes a drain O-ring and a new screw for the carburetor drain. So it's a flat screw. Pull it out. We'll just discard this old screw here along with all the bowl screws. We're going to clean that carburetor bowl a little bit more. I'm not going to go into details how to do it. I'll probably just do it with carburetor spray. Get all this gunk out of here. I see little chunks of those little chunks of dirt in there. That's going to clog your idle jet and everything else. This scooter's not going to run with a bowl that looks like that. Next, we're going to pull the idle jet out. This is the most common jet that will clog. It's the smallest jet in the carburetor. And then also the main jet, along with the main jet seat. So pull the main jet out. Use a 7mm wrench to get the main jet seat out. A little combination wrench, or you can use a socket. Want to make sure that thing's perfectly clean and all scrubbed, and all those small holes are all clean. The last thing I'm going to do is check the float bowl. Most of the time the needles are in pretty good shape, and there's accurate ways to check the float height. I could tell the float height is going to be a little bit too low, and the way you check it is you just tip it right where the float wants to tip back into the carburetor. And see that line right there? That should be parallel with the surface, the machine surface of this carburetor body where the float bowl goes into. So to make adjustments, there's a tab right here. And normally you would never ever have to make an adjustment to this, but somebody obviously tampered with it and didn't know what they were doing. So we're gonna go ahead and bend that tab up just ever so slightly and then try again. And it's not as critical as a lot of people think it needs to be. Just a little bit more. And once that's parallel, you're pretty much at the correct float height. And that's really close to parallel with the carburetor body. So now the float height is set. The last thing I pull out is the mixture screw. A lot of amateurs that take these apart, they'll lose the O-ring, the spring, and the washer that's located in the mixture screw. So on these later carburetors, you can see it's like a D-shaped security screw. We do sell the tool. You can look in the description of this video for the part number for the handy little tool to remove the mixture screw or make adjustments if needed. And I can see there's a little ridge of grunge on that mixture needle. It's never going to idle right with that grunge on there. So in addition to the spring, much further down in this mixture screw cavity should be a flat washer and an O-ring. And I was looking down the cavity and I can't find one. I mean, I don't know if the camera gets it. You can just see the aluminum in there. And typically I have a bent paper clip to kind of scoop the O-ring and the washer out. And I'm not able to do that. So guess what? I think we're going to have to find a new, put a new washer and O-ring. And again, look at the description of this video. You can see the part numbers for all these missing parts that we're coming across on this carburetor. And we'll just keep on moving forward. So I could dismantle this all the way and ultrasonic clean it and give it a thorough cleaning. I don't think it's really needed. It's not completely grungy. We're going to go ahead and pull this cap off the carburetor. And typically these screws are very tight. One's already missing. So they've obviously lost one of the screws, which is not a good thing. So you got 4 of these step screws normally. And we do have the replacement step screw, and I'll go ahead and pull one of those out. They look a little different because the key-in original step screws are no longer available. Pull this out. It looks like they actually had the diaphragm and didn't really mess with that, which is a good thing. There's also the spring in there. Pull this out. You do not want to get fuel on this rubber diaphragm. It will tend to ruin it, and it's a rather expensive part to replace. One thing I do notice is this thing is sticking in there. That's not good. And there's a big grunge buildup on this needle. So that's got to be cleaned before we put this carburetor all back together. So they may have cleaned or replaced one jet in the carburetor, but there's plenty of other problems with this thing before we can get it going. So we'll clean all those parts. So during the process of cleaning this carb, there's one jet that's integral with the carb body that I was unable to clean. And I tried every trick of the trade. I tried heating this up, because what this is your choke jet. I may be able to clean the two replaceable jets, no problem, and the scooter will run flawlessly, but it will never cold start unless this little fine passage is cleared out. And that passage is so fine. I have the finest piece of steel wire in this mandrel right here to try to ream it out, and I've had no luck getting it through. I've heated this up, I put pressure on the passage, I've ultrasonically cleaned it. Unfortunately, sometimes you get a gummed up carburetor, and this could just lock you down in your path. And there's no sense in me putting this carburetor back together. It's never going to cold start correctly unless that passage is absolutely perfectly clear. So at this point, I can keep on playing with it and playing with it. You could try to drill it out, and if you do that, you're going to end up probably changing that specifically metered size that's been drilled out to originally from the factory. It will never quite run correctly. Just cut your losses with a carburetor like this that's dirty, and just put a brand new replacement carburetor on it. There may be cheaper carburetors out there. Believe me, they do not work on these scooters. The original carburetor has been machined and manufactured and all jetted correctly for this engine. They have countless hours when they've engineered the scooter. You can't just throw any old carb that you want on there. It may kind of work, but it's not going to work optimal. So we'll get the throttle cables all hooked back up. Tighten down both of the lock nuts. And before we even install the carburetor, good time to adjust the throttle free play. There's tons of free play right here. So we'll go ahead and we can tighten up both the push cable, but mostly the pull cable is going to need some adjustment. So you want a little bit of free play in there. That's about right. And a lot easier to adjust while the carburetor's out. All right, so we have both clamps for the carburetor. They're still present here. That's a good thing. And we'll go ahead and install the carburetor. So you got the pair of wires that go underneath the carburetor. You got a vent hose that's routed towards the left of the motor, and it goes in a little clip at the very front of the motor. You're not going to see this in the video, but there is a little clip that will hold the hose down there. And this is your drain vent hose. And typically I like to get the carburetor into the larger boot. And then at that point, you can get it into the manifold, the intake manifold. Also, look at these intake manifolds. These scooters are getting old. Oftentimes, you'll find an intake manifold that's got some cracks in it. And now it's time to tighten up those clamps. Flat blade screwdriver. And we'll go ahead and hook up the wiring. And go ahead and cover up the wiring with this boot and secure it with that clamp. We have the fuel hose to hook up. Somebody disconnected this evap hose. It's not even connected to the motor. That needs to be addressed. And we're also going to need to tap into this line for the vacuum petcock signal for the replacement fuel valve that we used to replace that electric fuel pump. Go ahead and use this vacuum tee to tap into this vacuum line that also goes to your air injection. The air injection there opens up a valve to add extra air to the exhaust stream so the engine runs a little cleaner. So this tee is all set up, and actually before the fuel line we'll reconnect this evaporative emissions hose here. Hopefully the carbon canister isn't too flooded because some of the hoses weren't connected correctly. And if you're ever wondering what the correct hose routing is on your scooter, there is a label that's located right at the front of the frame that has the vacuum hose routing diagram. And that's a federally mandated sticker that they do in North America. It shows you how that hose routing is. And we'll put a clip onto the fuel line. Next, we're going to go ahead and fill up the fuel tank, and I'll see if the scooter, purge the first little bit of fuel through the fuel line before I connect it to the carburetor. So we'll just do a quick little crank and see it just pumped a little fuel. And we know that the fuel tap is flowing, and just want to get any debris that may be in the fuel line out before it goes into this fresh carburetor. Go ahead and put the line on there, and we'll get the scooter started. Before you use the scooter, I noticed the people that were working on it, the prior owner, took the door that goes over the spark plug off. That's bad news, because what that cover does is it takes the air from the fan and shrouds it around the cylinder to cool the cylinder. So you need that plastic piece in there to properly cool the engine. So we've primed the carburetor, and it should start right up. It's on the choke right now, so as it warms up, the idle will drop. We know fuel's flowing, no issues there. I know there's plenty of other issues with this scooter. Just like that silver ET4 that I reviewed that has very low miles, there's a ton of problems that come with an older scooter that's been sitting for a while. And before I would take this scooter on the road, I would replace many of the hardware bits that are just missing throughout this whole scooter. Double check everything, including the front wheel bolts. I don't even know if I would ride on these tires. The tires on the scooter are quite dry rotted. They have plenty of tread. The scooter's only got 150 miles, but typically my rule of thumb, if a scooter's been just stored outdoors and the tires are over 10 years old, just replace them both in the interest of safety. You can get inexpensive tires if you're on a budget. The other thing I do is change all the fluids. The front brake feels pretty tight and good, which is a good thing. I'm certain it's probably still the original brake fluid, but sometimes the brake fluid's completely deteriorated, and that could cause braking performance. So flush the brakes, change the engine oil, gearbox oil, and any other maintenance that would be due for this scooter as per the miles. So if it was about around 7,000 miles, I would probably go in there and change the dry belt, check the valves, and do all that kind of stuff. And just pivot points in general, center stands, all that stuff. The grease is hardened. Even this rear brake doesn't feel so good. Grease all those pivot points, and you'll have a scooter that has plenty of life still in it. So I just want to give you a glimpse of a scooter that somebody attempted to start working on and do it themselves, and unfortunately they failed miserably in many different aspects, all the way from the ignition system, all the way to the carburetor, the fuel system, even something as simple as the spark plug door, and the battery terminals were left out. You can't miss steps, you can't miss hardware. There's only one way to do it, and it's the correct way. And obviously, practice makes perfect. No one's perfect. Even the professional mechanic can make errors, but the more you know, the more you're gonna succeed at your repairs on your scooter. So I hope that helped everybody out, kind of just giving you a little insight of a scooter that might come through my shop. Normally I just hand this right off to one of my 3 technicians. They would just take it over, and they would be complaining to me like, oh my gosh, this was left off, this was that. And I usually would note it all in the repair order. So this is a robot here. Hope you found that video pretty interesting. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. Until next time, keep your Vespa rubber side down and stay safe. Make sure your scooter's perfectly maintained, and you'll have a ride that will last a long time.